Foot fetishes, swingers, hot wives, BDSM. In the world of sexuality, there's something for everyone. But what if your thing was no thing? I'm talking about asexuality. Asexuality is an umbrella term, but generally refers to a person who doesn't experience sexual attraction. But ace people might be in a relationship, might desire romance, and might have children. Are you confused? Don't worry. My next guest is the professor of health sciences at Brock University in Ontario, Canada, where he has taught and conducted research for the last 30 years, primarily in the area of human sexuality. He's also the author of Understanding Asexuality, and today he's going to help us understand what it is and isn't, why it matters, as we ask the question, is asexuality an orientation or a symptom? This is the Curious Introvert podcast with me, Meredith. Around here, we explore taboo questions and societal blind spots. My mission is to inspire curiosity by exploring the nuance and paradox of our world. Please help me welcome the man making sense of psychology and sexuality, sex ed teacher for grown-ups, Dr. Tony Bogaert. Thanks for being here.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
So I thought we could kick things off by playing a little game called What's the Difference?
Okay.
You didn't know you were signing up for a game show.
No, I didn't.
Do
I get prize money at the end?
Oh, unfortunately, this is like that,
no.
That game show that was on TV a while ago where the points don't matter, you know?
Okay.
So it's called What's the Difference? So what is the difference between asexuality and celibacy?
Well, celibacy is a choice not to have sex, and asexuality is a lack of sexual attraction. So, yeah, people who are asexual choose not to have sex, but it's partly because, or largely because, they're not attracted to anyone.
Number 2, what is the difference between asexuality and midlife disinterest in sex?
I would say for the vast majority of asexual people, they have been asexual for their entire lives. And therefore, if someone has midlife disinterest or uninterest in sex, that's different than, for example, someone who's not been sexually attracted to people their entire lives.
What about asexuality and hyposexual disorder?
Yeah, it's related in the sense that oftentimes people who are asexual have low desire or hyposexual desire. But if someone, for example, has low sexual desire, they may not, for example, have an interest in other people, in part because that desire is what's stopping them. For people who are asexual, it's basically a lack of sexual attraction. Also, if someone does not identify as asexual, they shouldn't be diagnosed with hypoactive sexual desire disorder. And if they don't have any distress about their low desire, they shouldn't be diagnosed as well. Sorry, that wasn't a short answer.
Well, they are getting more complicated, so you're
They
doing
are.
great. Okay, I've got 3 more. The game is almost over.
Okay.
Asexuality and sexual aversion disorder.
Well, some asexual people can be averse to having sex, but generally speaking, people who are asexual generally just don't have a sexual attraction for others. So it's not really an aversion per se. There might be some level of that, but there is a distinction there as well.
Because sexual aversion disorder, is that a result of trauma usually?
It can be, and it is often associated with that. There might be multiple causes to any complex kind of sexual expression and interest. So I wouldn't say that's the only reason for why someone has an aversion towards sex. And certainly some asexual people may have a kind of low interest, in part because, you know what, that sounds kind of disgusting. So there might be a difference, or it might be overlapping at least to some degree in that context at times.
Okay. Asexuality and chronic stress and anxiety.
Well, the way we've framed asexuality and the way we understand it, it's not necessarily to do with, for example, a kind of chronic stress or chronic issues associated with stress. So I would say that there are times when asexual people are stressed, in part because society is putting pressure on us to have sex, but that stress is not necessarily symptomatic of the asexuality phenomenon that exists in them.
And the last one, what's the difference between asexuality and autism spectrum disorder?
Not everyone who is asexual is on the autism spectrum. Okay. There may be some individuals, and there is some evidence that asexuality is associated with, at times, the autism spectrum. But on average, the majority of asexual people are not on the autism spectrum.
And that concludes our game of What's the Difference? Congratulations, you won. You did great. You
Didn't
did
win any
great.
money, but thank you very much
All right, exactly.
for allowing me to
Well,
participate.
you did great. Well, that last question is particularly interesting because that kind of rolls over into the pop culture department of
Sure.
asexuality because people often credit Sheldon Cooper on Big Bang Theory as being asexual. And
Mhm.
that was really interesting for me to hear that because I had always thought that he was like an autism icon represented in popular culture.
Sure.
That was like the forward presenting reason for his not understanding the advances of Amy Farrah Fowler. So I thought that was a feature of his autism. Is that when there are two things that are true like that, are they separate descriptors or is one a feature of the other?
Again, yeah, asexuality is at times associated with autism spectrum. And so there is higher incidence of autism spectrum in asexual people relative to average sexual people or allosexual people. So there is an association there, a small one. In this particular case, we have to separate out, for example, one's lack of sexual attraction from what causes the lack of sexual attraction. So, regardless of what causes the lack of sexual attraction, the lack of sexual attraction is a phenomenon that needs to be understood and thought about in and of itself. So, if autism is helping to cause that, well, okay, that's one factor. There are probably other factors like prenatal hormones or, for example, environmental things. That doesn't negate the fact that this individual, in terms of their phenomenology, still lacks sexual attraction. So you can't necessarily say that it doesn't exist as a phenomenon. It doesn't exist as an orientation because of the specific cause behind it. If I'm understanding your question. Am I
You nailed it.
understanding? Did I? Okay, good.
Absolutely.
But I agree. I agree. Sheldon is an interesting example of an asexual person that may be influenced by his autism spectrum. And it's also interesting from, let's say, a cultural and fiction and media standpoint, why this is an interesting character. And it's in part an interesting character from my perspective because writers know that, yeah, it can create some interesting comedic tension to have, for example, an asexual person actually come up against this complex sexual world, right?
Well, it definitely makes for good television, but
Yes.
as you stated in our game show segment, it can be a lot of real life pressure. And you said, you know, they pressure us. So does that mean that your interest in the topic of asexuality is from a personal perspective?
I guess a little bit from a personal perspective in the sense that, sexuality is a fascinating subject matter, even in asexual people. I don't identify as an asexual person, so I'm coming out that way. But it's a fascinating subject matter for me, in part because sexuality is a fascinating subject matter. The reason I actually started doing asexuality research was because I was actually doing sexual orientation research, and I was on sabbatical at the time. And what that means is that I wasn't teaching or doing administrative stuff. So I was only concentrating on research, and I was probably thinking in a more free form way. And I came across an item on a questionnaire that asked a typical sexual orientation question. Who are you sexually attracted to? Are you attracted to men? Are you attracted to women? Attracted to both? But they gave an option, and that option was, I'm attracted to neither. And I thought, wow, this is an unusual sexual orientation question. And I thought, wow, these people are asexual. It'd be fascinating to study. And so that spurred me on.
Well, that's really fascinating because I read, and tell me if I'm wrong, because I believe you did your own survey, that about 1% of the world's population is said to be asexual. Is that accurate?
I think that's probably the best figure we have so far, but some estimates have been lower than that, and some have been significantly higher than that. You have to use very good samples, so representative samples if you can get them. And on average, I would say that the relatively good samples tend to fall within the 1% kind of range, especially if you define asexuality in a similar way to the way I've been doing it over the years.
How so?
As a lack of sexual attraction for others, that's relatively enduring. So, yeah, a lack of sexual attraction over someone's lifetime or a significant period of time, not just, for example, a low period at midlife, let's say. Okay.
Right, right. And sexual attraction is only a small part of our lives, but it's one we definitely like to talk about.
Oh,
But
yes.
because it
Oh.
because it only represents like a smallish part of our life, why do these labels matter so much?
Well, it's related to a primary interest that we have in terms of reproduction. And that's a fascinating thing, an important element of all organisms' lives. So that's part of it. It is fascinating, though, in a way that we devote so much time and energy to it, right?
Hmm.
And that it also drives us a bit crazy while we do that. So it is linked to reproduction. It is also linked to bonding between people, right?
Hmm.
So oftentimes our sexuality also bonds us to our mate, our partner, or partners. It's also a big source of pleasure for people. A lot of people get a lot of pleasure from sex, right? Thinking about sex, stimulating their partner stimulating them, or people stimulating themselves. So there's a lot of pleasure devoted to it. So that's part of the reasons why it's interesting.
And
Yeah.
the labels can be helpful. They can be also confusing. As I was exploring this topic, I thought it was such a good brain exercise. I kept going from one end to the other as I was trying to understand this topic of asexuality. Like for other queer labels, I get it. I'm like, okay, yeah, these labels are very helpful because people can more quickly find one another
Sure.
other people who align with their particular flavor of sexuality. Like that, okay,
Sure.
that makes sense. I understand it as a foundation for rights, like for things like marriage and
Uh-huh.
adoption and health insurance. Help me understand why the asexual label matters, particularly for society.
Well, it certainly matters for a lot of asexual people. It may not matter as much for asexual people on average relative to people who are out and much more visible in society. So, if you're a gay or lesbian person, for example, having an identity is very important in part because, yeah, it allows us to express oneself and to have legitimacy in society, if you want to put it that way. But it also, for them, is something that allows them to, in some sense, gain certain rights. And as a person who's out and visible, that is important. For asexual people, they're not as visible, they're a little bit more invisible. So, in terms of that kind of motivation for having an identity, may not be as strong. But I would say for everyone, they have some level of identification that's important that occurs in various aspects of their lives, right? So, you may identify as a man or a woman, right? And that may be important. You may not identify as a man or a woman and be, for example, non-binary, but that may be still an identification. But it may also be important within the context of, let's say, your background as an immigrant. And let's say I'm Spanish or Mexican American, for example. That's still something that helps to identify you and set you up as an individual and give you some level of, I guess, legitimacy. The identification process is important, I think, in everyone's lives. And sexuality is important in people's lives. And therefore, how we define ourselves, even including as an asexual, is important within that context, I would say.
Can people be kind of asexual? I'm reading some discourse on the internet about, being gray sexual or
Yeah.
kind of asexual,
Yeah.
and whether or not that is considered to be legitimate among members of that group.
It is, as far as I know, for most individuals who are asexual and define themselves as asexual, they're happy to have kind of a spectrum of sorts. And so, yeah, there's a gray asexual people who have some level of sexual attraction, some level of sexual interest, but it varies up and down in their lives a little bit. So some people who are gray asexual, there's also demisexual people, people who, for example, don't have really any sexual attraction for other people and are not interested in sex. And yet, if they form a very strong romantic bond with an individual, some level of sexual interest and sexual attraction emerges. And demisexual people probably are a phenomenon that are interesting and worthy of studying and thinking about. And those people too belong to probably the asexual spectrum. So that does make some sense to me as well.
This is where all of these labels, I can hear the voice of a listener, the most skeptical among them. And I
Yeah,
think the
sure.
most skeptical among them would say in response to this, can we just take a break from all these labels and, and just be? Is this just people trying to be special or what?
And yeah, it's, to some degree, there probably is an over labeling that goes on in society. But I also don't want to, I guess, downplay the importance of identification. We all do it to some degree, even if we don't necessarily say it out loud. We have some kind of connection to labels and identification. So that all makes sense to me, at least to some degree.
What I like about the labels is that it does cause you to be introspective and it makes you not feel alone, which can be really helpful. So, like the demisexual thing, it took me about 12 times to hear the demisexual label before I understood what it
Yeah.
meant. Because when
Yeah.
I heard it, I was like, oh, you mean so like all women? or like, oh, you're only sexually attracted to people you're in a relationship. I was like, that is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Then I let it marinate a little bit and I was like, oh, okay, I get it. Because non-demisexual, we'll go with women for now since we're using that example, might see a really hot guy and go, hey.
I know, right?
But a demisexual person, a demisexual
Yes,
woman might see a really hot guy and just be thinking about what she's cooking for dinner that night.
that's right.
But if she forms a relationship with that really hot guy, then she's all hot and bothered because like now they have this emotional bond, they have a
Yeah.
relationship. So now I get it. And what I love about labels is it makes us stop. It can, not everyone welcomes this invitation, but it can make us stop and think about, well, who am I? Not in terms of like what color of the rainbow do I want to be, but like what do I really feel inside? What is true,
Yeah.
capital T true for me inside? And I think that can be really helpful to live a fulfilling life.
Oh, absolutely. Again, I think there is an important process in terms of development psychologically, in terms of connecting oneself to these labels for a variety of reasons. But just following up on your idea about demisexuality and how you kind of got it and understood it eventually, it also suggests strongly another reason why we should be studying asexuality, because it ends up, in fact, allowing us to understand the broader phenomenon of sexuality, okay, the contrast aspect. And therefore, we can understand in part, for example, different avenues that people have, all people have, at least to some degree, in terms of how they become sexually interested and attracted and aroused. So there's a love venue or a love route, okay? And then there's a kind of lust route, but both of them can create lust in their own way, right? For demisexual people, right, it's really only the love route that creates, for example, this level of sexual interest. Average typical people have these two routes, okay? It's just kind of like a casual lust thing when you're looking at other people, but also there can be a kind of sexual interest and sexual attraction that emerges within the context of love too. So there's multiple routes to sex, and that allows us to, better understand the phenomenon of sexuality, in part because we're seeing some of this variation, including some of the variation that exists within asexual people.
And some of that variation is that people would not experience sexual attraction, but still desire romantic relationships. Can
That's
you
correct.
unpack
Yes.
that?
Yes. So, yeah, one of the variants in terms of the asexuality spectrum are people who are asexual but still romantic. Okay. And so these individuals, for example, may not have any kind of lust that in fact emerges in a romantic situation, but they may still have a kind of bonding with other people and a level of romance that they find appealing. So there's a kind of love bond that in fact still emerges in individuals who are, for example, lacking in sexual attraction. Now, not everyone who is asexual has that kind of romantic attachment. Some asexual people are also aromantic, don't have, for example, a romantic attachment. But yeah, there are asexual people that still have a romantic attachment to others. And again, that gets back at this idea that we're trying to understand sexuality better and human development better. And we get to understand that those two things can be somewhat separate phenomenon and can in fact occur in an individual without necessarily overlapping. And so that's important.
I am still having a hard time understanding that personally because to me, if you have a bond with someone that you're calling romantic, but you don't have sexual attraction, what you have is a friendship. Am
Yeah.
I just missing it? Am I totally missing it here?
Well, I think it's at a stronger level than just a friendship. Sometimes friendships kind of get to a point where there is a bit of romance involved in terms of there's a cuddling that goes on, maybe there's a certain level of physical kinds of activity, but it doesn't necessarily lead to sexuality. For this, it's a similar kind of level of romantic connection that occurs, let's say, for a husband and wife, where they may not have sex per se, but there's still some cuddling that goes on, still some kind of romantic kind of element in terms of being close to one another, sharing secrets, those kinds of things, sharing a special bond that's romantic in nature. Now, for most individuals, that romantic element can lead to sex, right? It can lead to a certain kind of, okay, I'm romantically attracted to this person, we're cuddling, and all of a sudden I get aroused, and that leads to sex. But for asexual people, there may be some cuddling, some romantic kind of connection to others, but that doesn't necessarily lead to sex. And for them, there is no connection between the romance element and sex for these individuals.
Can you give an example in your research, maybe of a specific person who, despite being asexual, is, say, married with children? Because I've heard that that happens, but that's another confusing part for people just starting to wrap their heads around the idea of asexuality.
Well, in some of the research I've done, in some of the studies, certainly some of the asexual people are in relationships. They are married, and some of them have kids. Okay. In that particular context, they would probably say something like, well, I'm romantically attracted to my partner. I wanted to have kids, but you know what? The sex thing is not something that connects with me. And yet I know that I'm romantically attracted to men or I'm romantically attracted to women and I want to connect with them. And I also have this kind of need and desire for, having kids. And these individuals may still end up reproducing.
Do you ever study the intersection between what people are calling the sexual recession and asexuality?
It's an interesting, overlap, the sexual recession referring to the fact that in recent years during COVID, but even prior to COVID and after COVID, there's been a decline in interest in terms of people's overall level of connection to sex. And so people are having fewer partners, they're having less sexual activity with a partner. And on average, there is what might be called a sex recession. There may be a number of different reasons for it. One is that there's just so much other stuff going on that, in fact, is distracting us from sex. Maybe there's also chemicals in the water that's reducing our hormones. It's very
Right.
possible.
Yeah.
Uh, so there's probably a number of different factors that might be reasonable to consider in terms of the sex recession. In this particular case, though, it's not necessarily really overlapping with the asexuality phenomenon in the sense that even if you're in the sex recession, you may have sex a little bit less often than you did when there wasn't a recession, okay? And you may be less interested in sex, but on average, you probably had some level of sexual attraction, some level of sexual interest throughout your life. And it's just during this particular period of time that it's gone down. So I would say it is overall a separate phenomenon.
It must be so challenging for you as a researcher to unpack these areas that overlap and are by their very nature gray.
Yeah, sure. Speaking of gray, sexuality, yes.
Yeah,
Uh,
right.
yeah. But it's also fascinating, I would say, because again, you know, the subject of human sexuality helps to understand us as a species, as a person.
Hmm.
And so all of these things that creates variation actually is interesting because it ends up helping us to understand the phenomenon better.
I love that you like joked about the water. Like if someone is experiencing low sexual desire because their drinking water is wacky, right? That would be so sad. And they say, well, I'm asexual. I wonder if people over claiming that label is hurtful to the actual ace people. Does that make sense?
That's interesting. Yeah, it may be. In some sense, asexual people may feel like, I only want people who really truly are lacking sexual attraction in their entire lives, and then variations in and amongst that to be asexual and to identify as asexual. So I could see some asexual people being concerned about that. I would say overall that my experience with asexual people is they're pretty welcoming. So if someone wants to
Mhm.
identify as asexual for a variety of reasons, there may be, open arms. But
Mm.
I would say if I were to do research on asexuality and study asexuality myself, I would be fairly strict in terms of my definitions of what an asexual person is. For example, someone who lacks sexual attraction or is very low in sexual attraction for an enduring period of time, including their lifetime.
So, would an asexual person masturbate in the example of the strict guidelines you're giving for a study on it?
Yeah, some asexual people still masturbate. So it may seem contradictory in some sense because it's like, what do you mean? This person is kind of sexual because they're masturbating. There's a variety of reasons why some asexual people still masturbate. They masturbate on average at a lower level than average sexual people. So let's get that straight. Okay. But yeah, there's a variety of reasons why some asexual people still masturbate. Some may not really have any sexual connection to others, no sexual attraction, and may not even have kind of what might be considered sexually arousing feelings at all. But what they might want to do is, for example, to relieve stress or to what one asexual person called cleaning out the plumbing, they may end up masturbating for that reason.
Okay.
There's other reasons as well. So, if someone lacks sexual attraction for others, they may still have some level of sexual desire. They may still have some level of sexual arousal. They may not connect that to other people, but they may still, for example, have some level of kind of non connected sexual desire. And they may feel like they want to release that as well. And therefore, they may end up masturbating for that reason. So, there is some evidence that asexual people, even if they don't connect their attractions to other people, may still have some level of desire. But on average, they would have lower desire and lower levels of masturbation relative to average sexual people.
Hmm. I want to switch gears into the historical and evolutionary lenses. Hey, you know what's crazy? YouTube told me that only 3.9% of those of you who watch are actually subscribed to the channel. If you want to see me again, consider hitting subscribe and turn on the notifications for new episodes. Okay, back to the show. From
Okay.
a historic perspective, do we have any early accounts of asexuality?
Well, in my book, I talk a little bit about the history of, the asexuality book that I wrote, Understanding Asexuality. I do talk a little bit about the history of asexuality in terms of, for example, figures in history that may have been asexual. And there are a number of people that did not end up having any kind of partners that people knew of. Okay. They didn't necessarily, therefore, get married or have any kids. And they seemed to be a solitary individual in terms of any kind of romantic connections. That includes, for example, Emily Bronte. That includes Newton, for example. And these individuals may have been asexual. Okay. And that is interesting kind of, I guess, potential history associated with asexuality. Now, we don't know for sure because, their lives were hundreds of years ago, and we don't know 100% what was going on. And some have speculated that, for example, Emily Bronte may have been gay, for example. And therefore, at that time period, it was difficult for a gay person, lesbian, to end up seeking out attraction and activities with same sex. And therefore, if she was very introverted and solitary and was gay, it may have been something that she just ended up, for example, maybe masturbating at times. Who knows? So there are people in history that have been put forward as potentially asexual. Whether they were truly asexual or not, we don't know for sure. There's certainly some characters throughout history that also had an asexual aura, like, for example, Sherlock Holmes. Arthur Conan Doyle, for example, probably projected an individual who had low passions associated with typical human endeavors, including, let's say, food wise, also sex wise, and so on and so forth. He was supposed to be this intellectual person, right? Solving mysteries. And for Arthur Conan Doyle, as a writer, again, it may have been a very interesting way for him to, for example, project this character who had this aura of just being an intellectual, and that was it. And therefore, it was helpful in terms of writing his drama, his kind of dramatic tension that he was going for, and so forth, right? So, through some elements of, for example, drama, also, certain characters have had a kind of asexual aura, and including, for example, the Virgin Mary, right? Throughout history,
Mm,
right? So,
that's
this
interesting.
person, yeah. And so, again, this person is projected in terms of her religious life as being very, very focused only on religion. And therefore, this element of sexuality is, in fact, minimized to, in fact, showcase the fact that this person was, in fact, very concentrated on other aspects of life, the spiritual aspect of life.
I also find the historical topic of eunuchs really interesting, and I don't necessarily think that's like obviously asexual because from what I understand, they exist in all cultures, which is fascinating. It's a
Yeah.
really fun rabbit trail. But what's interesting to me about it is kind of something you alluded to earlier, like, oh, sex straight drives us crazy. And so, usually against their will, in many cultures, men were castrated. And so, no testicles means no testosterone production, means, you know, I don't know, they were freed up to think about other things apparently, and
Yeah.
so they were made to be the right hand man of the leader of countries. And that really got me thinking, not that I want people to be castrated, but it is an interesting historical example of like, okay, is sex just a distraction? Do asexuals have an advantage for certain aspects of life because they don't have this other thing at their ankles all the time?
Well, it's interesting. It's possible. Yeah, there's fewer distractions within the context of sex, especially, for young people who are sexual people. It's a very distracting part of life, right? It's a focus on life that's, wow, very preoccupying, right? So I don't think anyone's ever done any research on, for example, asexual people and compared them to sexual people and looked at, for example, the other activities that asexual people are doing, is it higher than average sexual people in terms of, are they more likely to read books? Are they more likely to, for example, have other interests in a very strong way? In part because sexual people, are preoccupied about their appearance, they're preoccupied about finding a partner and so on and so forth. So it'd be an interesting study to see if, in fact, yeah. So it's a good research project if you want to work on that together, Meredith. Yeah.
I was going to say, have we just established your
No.
next research project?
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe. So, from an evolutionary perspective, how does asexuality make it through? Because we see in nature examples of same sex activity, but what about asexual activity? Is it in nature in the animal kingdom? And how does asexuality make it through evolution since it's by its nature non procreative?
Yeah. And it's an interesting puzzle. So, just one distinction is, of course, there's asexual species as well, right? So, there are species that actually reproduce without actually having a partner, right? Right. So,
Right.
single-celled organisms, for example, many of them are in fact asexual and will just end up splitting in two and reproducing that way. When we're talking about asexuality within humans or within species like humans and other species, there's also variability, and some individuals are in fact asexual. So, for example, there's research on sheep, and some of the sheep are, of course, very much reproducers and are very much interested in having sex with the other sex. And then there's some individuals within a species that are attracted to the same sex, don't necessarily reproduce, but seem to be attracted to the same sex. And there is some evidence in some species of asexual organisms within that species. So within, for example, sheep, yeah, there's evidence that, for example, yeah, majority of them are interested in sex with the other sex. Some of them are interested in sex with the same sex, and some of them are not interested in sex at all with either, right? So there is evidence for that. And why is that the case? How is that variability something that sustained itself, presumably through evolutionary history? And it's a tough question because, on average, yeah, gay people don't reproduce as often as heterosexual people, and asexual people wouldn't necessarily reproduce as often as heterosexual people. So there might be, for example, mechanisms in place at times where, for example, there's an advantage within a family to have diversity, where some of them, for example, are reproducing, and then some of them don't necessarily reproduce, but help, for example, the reproducers within the family. And that can pass on genes as well, right, to next generation. And so there might be, for example, genetics and other factors that, in fact, push certain people, particularly within, let's say, a large family, to ultimately not necessarily reproduce if they can help other siblings, let's say, that are reproducing. So there might be an advantage that way. And that's been put forward within the context of, the sustainability of, let's say, homosexual genes or mechanisms that end up, for example, making an individual more likely to be gay than straight. So that's speculation. There is some evidence for that, but on average, that has to be researched much more to actually determine if, in fact, those factors really do have sustainability through evolutionary history.
I feel like I'm just giving you a big list of more stuff to research here.
Yes, you are, but that's okay. That's my
Yeah,
job.
right. You've only been doing it for 30 years. So, what's another 30? No big deal.
There you go. How old will I be by then? Oh my God. Oh,
It might be a while.
yeah.
So, you are a sex ed teacher for young adults, essentially.
Yes.
As I understand it, sex is an important part of wellness. It helps boost your immune system, improve your sleep, lower stress. If it's an ingredient for total health, is there like something else that asexual people do in order to gain those healthy supports?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. There is evidence that, yeah, if people have sex, have an orgasm, for example, they're more likely to be de-stressed a little bit, and that's probably helpful in certain contexts. And maybe asexual people still do that under certain circumstances anyway when they masturbate. So there's that. I would also say, again, going back to some of our other topics, like, sex is healthy. And if it's incorporated within, positive relationship, it can be something that's very bonding for individuals and very healthy at times. So I would say, yeah, that's definitely the case. But I will also say that sex, again, drives us crazy. And so there's a mad element to sex that, on average, drives many people crazy at times. And therefore, I wouldn't say that on average, sex is more healthy than not sex.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying. Like, is it net positive? Hard to
Yes.
tell. Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to tell. You have to balance it out.
As we close, I would love to kind of explore this is probably not a thing, the flow chart of asexuality. Like, if someone was trying to figure out, is this me?
Right.
What would be some helpful questions that they could ask themselves?
Sure. So I would say, for an individual, just do some research on it if you feel like you are asexual. But I would also say that, again, from my perspective, most people who are asexual probably knew they were different from, let's say, early adolescence, if not before that. And they recognized that, for example, everyone around me was, in fact, sexually attracted and preoccupied by the same sex or the other sex, and they were interested in having some level connection to them, not just on a romantic level, but also on a sexual level. If that's not you, right, and it wasn't you for most of your life, then you know what? You may, in fact, be asexual. So I think people would recognize that they were different, and they may not have given that a label, right? They may have just felt like, well, I'm just not interested in that, and I know I'm different than, my friends. Now, I think people have an opportunity to label themselves in a way that they didn't have before, in part because of all this information. And there's support groups out there too. For example, asexual people are online and have a presence and have information about the asexuality phenomenon. So I would say if you lack sexual attraction and felt like you've lacked sexual attraction for a long period of time, and you're interested in finding out more, you can, go online and find information, including research articles, but also other information that you can find on the internet, right?
And your book sounds like it would be a good resource also.
Thank you. Yes, it's called Understanding Asexuality. and, and yes, I have another book probably coming out soon related to that. And it's on some of the interesting, fascinating, oddball, and crazy things that sex can make us do as well. And I think that's an important sort of subject matter for people to know about as well.
Both sound like they are fantastic reads. Is there any way that people can stay in touch with you? You have a website?
You can email me. That's a good way of doing
Okay.
that. So if you want to put my email up on your podcast, that works. And yeah, you can drop by my office at Brock University, St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada, near Niagara Falls.
That sounds fantastic. Thank you so much for this conversation. You did such a great job at breaking down the complex and making it understandable. So I think this will be a great launch point for people who want to learn more.
Thank you very much. I think your questions were also very good and helped me tremendously. So thank you, Meredith.
Absolutely.